Thank you. Good evening. Welcome to you all. I really believe you all come out this evening standing the rain. Um, Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Again, my name is Teresa Harris. I'm your FDA Vice President of the Government Section. And as was mentioned, I'm also an AUSA, an Assistant United States Attorney. District Human Trafficking is actually a statutory position that was created by one of the TVPA reauthorizations. So it's my great honor to serve as your moderator for tonight's panel. Um, Tonight's discussion will focus on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA. This is landmark anti-human trafficking legislation that was passed by Congress 25 years ago. And this is meant to be a collaborative discussion. So I'll provide time at the end for any audience questions, and there will be a reception after the panel in case you would like to have further discussion with our panelists or with yourselves about these issues. Um, Finally, my statements today are my own, do not represent the official views of the U.S. Department of Justice or U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California. And with that, let's briefly introduce our very distinguished panelists. First, the Honorable Beth Labson Friedman is a district judge for the Northern District of California. She was nominated by President Barack Obama and confirmed in the Senate in 2014. She currently sits in San Jose. Nagwa Ibrahim is the Director of Legal Services at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, also known as CAST. She leads a team of attorneys who provide direct legal services to survivors of human trafficking nationwide. She also leads a team of lived experience experts who provide training on human trafficking of youth. Martha Barty Parker is a retired special agent for the FBI. Special Agent Parker has investigated countless human trafficking crimes, state and federal, and is well known in our local area for her dedicated work to combat human trafficking, particularly in Oakland. Denisha Terrell is a survivor of human trafficking. At age 16, she bravely testified against her trafficker at trial in United States versus Edward Sullivan. Sullivan was later convicted of production of child pornography and possession of child pornography and was initially sentenced to 25 years in prison. Martina Vandenberg is the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, which she established in 2012. For more than 2 decades, she has worked to fight human trafficking, forced labor, rape as a war crime, and violence against women. So, to start, I'd like to offer you all a brief history of the TVPA and some relevant statistics. So, the TVPA was passed on October 28, 2000, and signed into law by then President Bill Clinton. It's landmark legislation. It's the keystone of the federal government's efforts to combat sex and labor trafficking in the United States and globally. Now, it's grounded in the 13th Amendment, which forbids slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. It was also highly influenced by decades of coordinated domestic and international efforts to eliminate sexual exploitation of women and girls and protect their fundamental human rights. Now, the image on the right here is actually of one of the Palermo Protocols on trafficking in persons that was adopted by the UN in 2000 and ratified by the US in December of 2000, shortly after we passed the federal TVPA. And currently, this protocol has about 117 signatories. So this is broad international consensus on the issue of trafficking in people. But domestically, one of the earliest of our federal laws to address sex trafficking was actually the Mann Act, which was passed in 2010, currently codified at 18 U.S. Code Section 2421. And that act sought to eliminate white slave trafficking. Now, I will be the first to acknowledge the problems with the Mann Act as it was initially written and enforced. It was vague. It was selectively enforced, often to discourage interracial marriage, for example. But it was one of the first attempts by Congress to respond to concerns that were raised by progressive movements of the 19th century about the dangers of sex trafficking, and in particular, the sexual coercion of children, girls in particular. And these concerns were actually echoed in the law that was passed by Congress 90 years later. The bottom quote is one of the findings directly from the TVPA as it was passed in 2000. Acknowledging that sexual slavery and trafficking of women and children are abhorrent to the principles upon which the U.S. was founded. So this law TVPA was envisioned as a comprehensive federal response to modern day slavery, as we're calling it. And it's focused, as Chris mentioned, on prevention, prosecution, protection of victims. The initial versions of this law, and actually these pictures are somewhat timely. The top top left is, if anyone recognizes, that's Pamela Price, who was the former DA in Alameda County, leading an anti-human trafficking. And others of these are from, I think one of these is from South Africa. So there have been movements globally to respond to this crime. But for here in the United States, our initial version of the TVPA established T visas and U visas was a big one. And these protect non-citizen victims of trafficking while their cases are pending. Another big one was these criminal statutes that we currently use. 1589, forced labor; 1590, labor trafficking; sex trafficking, 1591, document servitude, 1592, and of course our mandatory restitution for victims of trafficking offenses, codified at 18 U.S.C. section 1593. And also, one big thing that it did was establish the requirement for the federal government to produce reporting to tackle the problem from a data perspective. And one of them, one of the earliest ones, in fact, was the Trafficking in Persons report produced by the State Department. So it envisioned this whole of government approach to the issue of trafficking, which is very much reflected in our efforts, our federal efforts to address the problem today. I can tell you that, as one of the prosecutors in my office that's assigned to do human trafficking work, that work stretches over many, many of the government's bureaucratic arms, whether they are civil, whether they are criminal. And our work is unites us all in a sense of purpose. So the TVPA was reauthorized several times. These are some of the key things that happened from those reauthorizations. The major one is that in 2003, it created a civil cause of action against traffickers. It's codified in 18 U.S.C. section 1595. It also increased the criminal penalties and the liabilities for trafficking offenses, established a whole system of grants to assist state and local law enforcement and victim service providers to combat trafficking. Again, that's one of the big things that I do is argue with trafficking. It's assist local task forces, state and local task forces for our counties to access this money so that they can provide victim services to victims of trafficking and to enhance their ability to provide officers on the street and data analysts who attack these crimes. It also established measures to eliminate goods produced from forced labor in the consumer supply chain. So one of the most recent laws that was passed dealt specifically with the Uyghur region in China. Goods produced from that region. There have been other, actually some pretty famous cases, I think, in the Northern District specifically, dealing with goods, products that were brought to the United States from a labor supply that had been tainted by trafficking. So this is one of the ways that we address that federally. It also established human trafficking coordinators in every federal district. Yes, that's a statutory role. It has very specific things that we're supposed to be doing, including training, outreach, keeping the data, talking to find people, all those types of things. And also our training, reporting, statistical, screening, all of these directives for interagency cooperation to support victims and anti-trafficking measures. So our key civil and criminal statutes, I spoke about them earlier, but here are major ones. Forced labor criminalizes providing, obtaining, or benefiting financially from forced labor services. Criminally, that's a penalty of 20 years. 1590 is labor trafficking. It criminalizes recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for labor or services in violation of Chapter 77, which is the portion of the federal code that deals specifically with human trafficking cases. That's a stat max of 20 years. Our big guns here, 18 U.S.C. section 1591, sex trafficking. Now that criminalizes sex trafficking by force, fraud, coercion, or of any minor. It's a person under 18, or benefiting financially from a sex trafficking venture. The penalties for this are 10 to life. for sex trafficking of a minor, 15 for life if by force, fraud, coercion, or a minor under 14 years. And then, of course, 1595, which establishes our civil claims, titles any victim of trafficking civil cause against their traffickers or someone who benefited financially. Recover damages, which we'll get to. So, some statistics for you. Okay, so the criminal TVPA prosecutions nationwide, it looks like we've had from 2000 when the law was passed to 2023, the data ends at 2023 for this, about 2,918 cases over 23 years. In 2026, I'm going to estimate that we're likely over 3,000 at this point. The reason we don't have the data, at least from HTI, is funding. But at any rate, I expect that if these trends continue, probably will surpass 3,000 criminal federal cases for trafficking. And as you can see from this graph, it's overwhelmingly sex trafficking cases that get prosecuted in the US. Labor trafficking is this little slip of yellow colored things at the very bottom of this. Okay. And, as you can see, like the distribution between the two is pretty stark. I have my theories for why that is, but that's one of the things that we'll discuss, why there's such a difference between the number of sex trafficking cases that are prosecuted versus labor trafficking. You also see here that there's a big jump around 2013, which is another potential issue. Another helpful statistic is here, looking at the top platforms that are used in recruitment of victims. Again, the source of this is from HTI. So Snapchat, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Snapchat look to be the primary drivers of this by, unfortunately, a pretty wide margin. One of the biggest changes to human trafficking over the past 25 years, which is what we'll talk about, is how much of this conduct has migrated to online platforms. And in fact, it's the primary method by which children in particular are exploited through trafficking. Contacted by traffickers, encouraged or coerced to come to travel interstate to commit commercial sex or other sexual issues and crimes, and also the primary way by which money is exchanged. So our civil data actually very helpfully comes from our Human Trafficking Legal Center. Thank you, Martina, for these lovely slides. And as you'll see, the data is almost exactly sort of the opposite, right? Exactly, right? So we have here a total from 2003, when the TVPA first provided a civil cause of action, to 2025 last year, 1,629 cases. And most of them, for the majority of that, were labor trafficking cases. And it's only in about 2023 when we see a huge spike in sex trafficking cases. We'll get to why that is. I think Martina probably has some idea of why most recently we have this big spike in sex trafficking civil prosecutions. Another important statistic is this: the majority of these cases are brought against institutional defendants. We'll get also to what that means, who these people are, how they're operating in such a way that makes them liable for civil damages under this law. Again, about 1,425. So the majority of them are against these institutional defendants. So, keeping these statistics in mind, let's turn now to our panelists. Okay, so Marty, I wanted to ask you. So first of all, your career predates the TVPA. Is that correct?
Yeah, it started in 1995.
Okay, so what was it like before the passage of the federal law? As a FBI agent investigating these types of offenses?
Well, honestly, back in 1999, we weren't investigating. when I was a brand new agent. There's a guy in my squad who had a human trafficking case. Didn't have 1591 yet, so that was prosecuted as a man act. We did not have a specialist back then, so the victim and I think that was kind of the best that we did. Um, it was not until I believe 2003 that the FBI, probably because of the TVPA, started to do some research into the areas that had the highest instances of child sex trafficking. Reached out to those offices, San Francisco being one. There was 11 throughout the country decided that high trafficking and told me to do something about it. But that's when we also had the support of FBI headquarters and also the office.
So what did you do?
So I tried to do something about it. I knew that in this area, especially at that time, that there was no way that local agencies would be able to commit a body to a tactical task force. So I created a working group, uh, not necessarily a commitment there, where the investigators, the prosecutors get together, share intelligence, and help each other. Uh, at first, it started off very slowly. We met every other month, and the night before I didn't sleep well because I wasn't sure anybody was coming on the next day. But it is now a very robust working group. It's 40 plus investigators and prosecutors from all over the Bay Area and beyond at each meeting. And we have a list serve that has over 600.
So what can you tell us about how these cases, the criminal cases anyway, have evolved over the past 20
years? Like you alluded to, so much of it is online. Back when I first started, the internet was kind of brand new. There was no back pages or escort sites, say. There were some sites that were starting this up a little bit, more bulletin board stuff. But the majority of the recruiting happened in person. It made it even more difficult to prosecute cases, really, because they don't have the paper trail. If somebody is recruited via Instagram, you'll have those messages or friends or something to help. So it was more difficult. Also, with the cell phones becoming more and more everybody's lifeline anymore, right? Everybody has their electronic leash. That's, of course, the same with trafficking. But back in the day, that wasn't necessarily helpful. So we all didn't have that. So it was a lot more difficult to prosecute cases, for sure. And it's also more difficult sometimes to find it. But since 2000, I worked with especially Oakland police to do proactive operations in order to try to find go out to hey where these girls are hanging out, trying to get dates in order to try to find.
Yeah. So now you can use phones, the data contained in phones for all types of different reasons, right? To show where somebody's location is. Also like there's all these things that cache different types of photographs and videos and even payments, mobile processing payments, and all those things are records that are left in today's world. But those weren't even a bit back in 2000. Those before those apps.
Absolutely. Not all, but most of the evidence we have in today's cases are electronic, and the biggest thing is the phone of both victim and
what are some common risk factors for victims of trafficking in terms of who becomes vulnerable? Your experience.
The traffickers, and my experience is with domestic sex trafficking. Human trafficking is very big. I deal with domestic sex too, so that's one. Um, but in the world of domestic sex trafficking, the traffickers are very good at finding whatever hole it is. Whatever kind of vulnerability they have, they will do their best to fill that. What we have seen is that girls don't have stable home life, especially don't have a strong father figure in their life, seem to be very vulnerable. It's not a mistake that pimps have the girls call it that. Uh, you see a lot of victims who come from foster homes, for instance. Um, we see victims who have sort of addiction. That's the vulnerability in their lives. So fill that by becoming their supplier. Um, but also victims who come from very good homes, who kind of got mixed up with the wrong crowd, for instance, or just wanted a boyfriend, and the pimp is very common for him to act as a boyfriend in order to fraud.
So attention is one vulnerability.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Emotional bond is one of the traffickers.
Yes.
So, have I think the term is Romeo, um, who helps these sexual and relationships with their victims.
Yes, although I don't like to use that term. You'll hear the term Romeo pimp or gorilla pimp. That's kind of putting them in a bucket. And what I see is that pimp or any trafficker really will use whatever sorts of things are necessary to control their victim at that point. So it's a continuum. Sometimes they're more Romeo.
In your opinion, have the increased criminal penalties been an effective?
That's a good question. Honestly, I'm not sure that anything will make a trafficker say, you know what, I don't want to do that because I'm going to spend more time. However, we're putting them away longer, so we're keeping them from harming anybody else for a longer period of time. I do think that there is a deterrent factor in the traffickers going after. I do know of pimps who will strictly not not traffic because they believe that the or the
And then we saw a few slides ago. What do you have any theory for why there is such a discrepancy between sex and labor trafficking prosecutions?
Yes.
Tell me your theory.
Well, first off, you only get prosecutions when the investigators bring the U.S. Attorney's Office cases. So definitely cannot necessarily blame the prosecutors for this. I think that on the investigation side, we have not focused on it much. In my career, I haven't focused on it, and I had part of that is I had quite enough work with sex trafficking, and really it was only me most of my career doing stuff the entire career. I only had one name ever. So I think the problem is a lot on the investigative side, but also these victims are way more in the shadow than domestic sex. There's no website with their pictures on. They're not necessarily standing on a street corner. So there is a lot more to find these cases.
No, that makes total sense. And sort of my next question is about restitution. Have you found in the cases that you've handled that restitution ordered by the courts has been an effective way to make a victim whole?
Sadly, no. Interestingly enough, we were talking about this last week. I have sat at a conference with another survivor doing a case study. And She was awarded $17,500 in her case, and part of the agreement was for the subject to immediately provide $10,000 of that money, which said that. The survivor has not seen one penny of it. There does not seem to be any teeth whatsoever in restitution. And any of the girls that I've ever talked to who have been awarded restitution have told me they have. It's really unfortunate. Yeah.
Okay, Martina. So can you tell us some about the Human Trafficking Legal Center and what its mission is?
The whole idea of human trafficking legal center, and we essentially placed it up. About 670. These firms have done. So there was a case in the Eastern District of Virginia, Roe v. Howard. And the Roe versus Howard case was actually a U.S. diplomat, her Australian diplomat husband. They trafficked domestic workers from Ethiopia, first to Yemen, then to Japan. They held the domestic worker in forced labor in their home, but the point of the trafficking was also so that the husband could save. When the wife would tootle off to the U.S. Embassy, Japan to work. So we found a pro bono team, first Jenner and Block, and then for a second case, Jones Day. And those two firms, one after the other, litigated the case against this husband. The verdict in the first case was $3.3 million, and the verdict in the second case was $3 million. And the problem with this case is that it was never prosecuted, right? An American diplomat in the U.S. housing abroad, not prosecuted for this. And so Nova and I were talking about earlier, for some of the forced labor survivors, including people who are victims of sexual service, the only option. And so my favorite TVPA is actually TVPRA of 2003, when civil cases became possible. And so we've been tracking every civil case ever filed ever since. And so one of the things that we do is with pro bono teams that are handling.
So can you give us an overview, and we have these statistics obviously, of sort of the landscape of civil enforcement of the TVPA since Congress created the right in 2003? What types of matters are being prosecuted civilly, and who are the defendants?
So when I look at the blue line, the little blue line, which is the trafficking cases, the forced labor cases that started at the beginning, the people who built civil law in this country are domestic workers. So if you look at the number of forced labor cases that have been brought, 135 of 654 forced labor cases that had been filed as of December 31st, 2025, they were all filed by domestic workers. A lot of those cases were cases that we brought in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, New York area, where it was a domestic worker victim. You've had these cases out here too. There was Park Shin, controversial for Korea. So when I look at the blue line, I understand that those represent trafficking survivors, some of whom were in my office weeping because federal prosecutors wouldn't win. And so I would have to say to my client, like, I can't force the federal government to bring your case, but after 2003, you have the opportunity to bring your own case, and you can hold the trafficker accountable yourself. Now, what happened, and the reason why we have this explosion of green, is because a change in the law. Congress amended the law so that you could prosecute civilly not only the trafficker, but anyone who financially benefits by participating in a venture where they knew or should have known it was in violation of the trafficking statute. That venture liability for those who financially benefit caused an explosion. As I say, a whole bunch of plaintiffs' lawyers awakened and suddenly realized we can bring these federal cases, and so they did. And so a huge number of these cases our cases. And not just against the hotels individually, but also against the franchises, some against internet service provider companies. So the green is sex trafficking cases, and a lot of those cases, it would be partially useless to go after the defendant because many of the individual defendants are destitute, bankrupt, impoverished. But you can go after corporate defendants on the financial benefiting theory and actually get recovery. But I think, my friends, that's the real mystery from my perspective, because the sex trafficking cases against adults are very, very there isn't a lot of transparency about how.
Why do you think that is?
Because many of them settle, the vast majority of them settle, and they settle with a confidential settlement agreement. So 2025 was one of the first. So civil damages generally in official damages ordered by judges or awarded by juries, and also public-facing settlements surpassed $1 billion. So that was a huge marker, right? $1 billion in damages, and that's just what we can see because there are so many of these private settlements that are secret, both in civil cases for sex trafficking, but also in civil cases for labor trafficking. So there's a whole other mountain of damages in the civil cases.
So I wanted to ask you, about the importance of civil counsel, and specifically for restitution purposes for criminal victims and also for civil victims. How is it that a civil counsel or a victim's counsel can assist, for example, a criminal victim in obtaining restitution?
So important. I'll just give an example. We recently had a case involving sex trafficking. We found pro bono counsel for her. She was represented by labor law. In that particular case, there was restitution for the children who were unrepresented. There were about 10 of them. They were all identified, of course, by pseudonym Sarah J. And the numbers next to the children's names who didn't have representation were $3,000, $5,000, and then you get to Jane Doe, who's actually a represented party, represented pro bono by a law firm, and the restitution amount was $840,000. And so you can tell just immediately, without much discernment, who had a lawyer. It's enormously important for victims of trafficking to have lawyers in court. And I see it most of all in the forced labor cases, because while defendants in sex trafficking cases may be, in some cases, destitute, although not always, right? We have a really good record, actually, where there's a private lawyer. It's really good. Okay. In forced labor cases, almost always the traffickers live on the grid. And almost always the Department of Labor sends a specialist from the wage and hour division to do the calculations. Almost always, if that person has pro bono counsel, it was always my practice to do our own calculations, to compare notes with the Department of Labor, to demand that we got liquidated damages under the Fair Labor Standards Act and not just straight wages, back wages. And so the restitution amounts in forced labor cases are enormous. We had a case in the District of Maryland where it was more than $300,000. And by and large, in forced labor cases, restitution is selected because people are living on the grid and the financial litigation unit filter through it for the federal government has enormous power. Much more than I do.
So I also just quickly wanted to ask you about the process of partnering with law firms for pro bono. How have they been receptive to that? A lot of the young lawyers coming out of law school may not know very much about the TVPA or about these organizations that are dedicated to doing this practice. So, their introduction may come from a firm like Latham or Wilmer Hale or Mofo or whatever. How receptive have they been?
Enormously. So we've trained 5,000 lawyers across the United States to do cases. And when we get a referral, we go to the law firm now.
That's fantastic. Okay, so, Tanisha, you're next. Can you tell us your story?
Okay, so my name is Tanisha. Marty is a major part of my story. So we worked together, and my case was against a man named Edward Solomon. Um, he, there was a lot of things that me and him, but at the end of it, they made sure that I would testify. And I think the major thing in my case that does stand out of other people, is that he represents himself. And I had to speak to him as his own lawyer, which before I was told I would never speak to him again. But going into the courtroom was right then and there when it came on to me that.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, it was the defendant went pro se and acted as his own lawyer during the trial and questioned you as his victim during the trial. Okay, so were there any guardrails put in place in terms of um, any any rulings by the judge about what questions he could ask or not ask?
No, there were no boundaries, there were no rules. It's let it go on.
So, I mean, what other than that, having perhaps shadow counsel who could have asked those questions, which sometimes is a method that we can use in a case like this. What would have helped your trial process go smooth?
Probably not giving me false hope that I think in any situation you should look in and get the um and ready, you know, without
So, setting expectations would help, giving you a better sense of the trial process, including the possibility that you would have to speak to them. So, you have before you an audience full of mostly lawyers and some judges. What do you want them to know about working with survivors of trafficking?
when you guys are done with this, but they will still need help. You're the crowd, they will still need help after this. So maybe it was years before, maybe it's recent. But most of us want to forget, leave it alone, but we have to speak about it. So I think that if you are a lawyer or if you are in a situation like this, make sure that there are resources and programs after you guys speak to them that they can go either as therapy or a drop-in center or whatever for them to actually go and unprocess their after everything is done.
What do you think is the most effective way to prevent
Hard one. Because as you say, they get girls from broken. So my home was broken. Um, I did already go through being molested. I already knew all this. So once he came to me, I was already sexualized. I was already kind of familiar with them. So I think in order to help us not, in order to help us not fully go down that road, is to bring the program. Like Missy, I did Missy. I was there every single day, every hour I could be there. Because I feel like if I was here, I wouldn't think about what's going on here. So I think that helps bringing people into the schools, educating teachers, educating doctors, educating everyone to see sexual trauma because that starts first. Sexual trauma starts everything first. Sometimes it may be sexual trauma, it may be emotional trauma, but as long as these people that are supposed to be officials, that are supposed to be um, ahead of us, looking after us, if they can spot something in us and make sure that they get that problem taken care of, then there won't be another route for us to take to go down that road and get, kidnapped or forced or coerced or, think that this is love because no one else is showing love here. What it is.
what types of programs did you see provide to you that are helpful?
Missy, what they did, they brought in therapy. And then also just make sure that we got to experience life. We'll go just rollerblading. They brought in bunnies for us, children. They took us on like little adventures just to go out and Six Flags and things of that nature. And then sometimes we'll just sit there and cook and talk and just have that open environment to where I can come and be myself and don't have to give in order to receive love. So I think that was a major part of it. I think what girls and boys as well, because boys will go through this as well. We just need somewhere to where we can just sit down and just be loved and not think, oh, just because I'm loving this person, I'm going to give it. You know.
So for those who aren't familiar with this, it's one of our fairly robust programs, victim service providers. It's a huge network of them. Thank you, Antonia. I see you. With the San Francisco Collaborative Against Human Trafficking. But C provides services to victims of trafficking. One of the most urgently needed, which is actually housing, which is a big problem in this area. And actually, that's sort of my next question for you. Did you feel that you had adequate support from at least victim services in our office when your case was prosecuted here for all of those collateral needs that you identified? So. All right, room for improvement. Yes,
But that was years ago.
Yeah.
So like everything has changed. Right? I hope everything has changed, right? But yeah, I was years ago, so I guess I was attention.
No, it's just possible that we just didn't have as many good relationships in place. And finally, I just wanted to ask you about the sentence that was imposed. So here's a press release that our office and Maine Justice issued back in 2012 about the sentence. Were you part of the process of sentencing? Did you speak at the sentencing at all? Did you feel the judge listened? No.
After he interviewed me a couple of times. The only way that I was updated from the cases was through Marty, so when it was update my mom, that's about it.
Are you pleased with that sentence?
Mixed emotions.
Did you ever receive any restitution as a part of the case?
Not restitution, but I was paid to, I guess, prepare for the case. So every day I went to meet with someone to get, the information down. They did give me a set report every time I went up, and then once everything was done, they gave me.
They covered your travel expenses and preparation expenses as it's statutes that allows. Judge Freeman. So you've handled civil and criminal cases, trafficking cases. What is the most distinctive aspect of these cases from your perspective as a trial judge?
Well, there's a big difference between handling the civil cases and the criminal. In the criminal cases, the United States Attorney's Office has a robust case. The case gets developed and it gets prosecuted, comes to a conclusion. But in the civil cases, the quality of the lawyering varies, and the difficulties of reaching not the direct perpetrator, but the deep pockets is very complicated. So I had two civil trafficking cases, one involved checks, and it was an interesting situation because I only know the names of the victims by their name or first name. And then in the civil complaint, I learned the facts of what that victim is laying out. And I was reading one of those cases that was not being handled that well, and the facts started looking familiar. And I had done some research on the law and understood that a civil case is automatically stayed while a criminal case is going on. And so I asked the civil attorney representing the plaintiff, does your client have a criminal case? And she said, they don't. It was the case that Marissa was prosecuting in my courtroom. And Marissa didn't know that there was a civil case. The civil lawyer didn't know. And there I am in the middle, putting it together. And then I reached out and we put it together because she could reach the victim. And I then stayed the civil case because the last thing you want is in the civil case to have that discovery going. It is, imagine deposing the victim before that's what happened. So I was just educating myself on law, stumbled across this. And so and then when the criminal case was concluded, I lifted the stay, and then it ultimately ended up, the complication in the hotel cases, this is where the quality of the lawyering matters. It wasn't hard to find the little, flea bag hotel where it was obvious these girls were coming in day after day, living in horrible conditions, and the cleaning staff knew exactly what was going on. But because of the way the hotels are organized, they are individually owned franchises. And so you have to sue the chain owner, which are the biggest names in hotels. And then they fight it because they've crafted the franchises to have no connection. It takes a good lawyer to find all the training materials and the requirements for franchises to train people and to ultimately get what you need. And so Martina knows all of this. But it was, for me, what was difficult is having, in a sense, the patience and to wait for these plaintiff lawyers to develop the case the way it needed to be developed and to manage the motions to dismiss in a way that bought them as much time as they could, but they still had obligations. I mean, I don't take a side, but clearly these cases need to proceed. Then they end up in confidential settlement. And so in this one human trafficking case, sex trafficking, I have no idea what was paid out. And so that was very difficult. And then I just finished a case involving labor trafficking. And these were people brought from Eastern Europe to be workers on building a factory in the Bay Area of a prominent trillion-dollar company. And so it ended up where, of course, big companies settled because they didn't want their names associated. I have no idea how much, but they were making the money off of it. And ultimately, the judgment against I guess you call it staffing agency from Eastern Europe, has a default judgment against it for the lawyer who's going to try to collect in Eastern Europe. I don't know whether that's possible. It was a large judgment. It was a lot of money. And we give them all the tools they need, but it's still a difficult thing to do. In switching back to the criminal cases, of course, in a sense, our work is not hard until the sentencing, because prosecutors and the defense lawyers are protecting their interests. I would say that sentencing the trafficker, the ringleader, is not a hard thing to do. And the high sentences and the mandatory minimum are a big help to having these sentences. Personally, this is one area of the law where I'm quite convinced that these perpetrators will reoffend. And I even had someone who reoffended from prison he moved on from minors and tried to move into the adult world. But of course, Marisa this was her case as well, of course, you're recorded when you're in jail, like everybody knows that. And she played the tapes of this person setting up his business as he was going off to federal prison. Sentencing those people is not hard, but especially in cases involving money, when you have a victim who becomes a trafficker, they age out and into a world where money still matters, and the addiction and the attention from the trafficker is still there. Sentencing a victim perpetrator is the hardest thing. And so there's nothing in the law that provides any escape hatch for that group of people. And I think it's a pretty big group. I think it's pretty common. Just because a girl becomes 17 or 18 years old and no longer desirable to the business doesn't mean she has a place to go. It's not like she just goes back home and says, Mom, I'm home. These are really ruined lives. And then when these victim perpetrators get out of prison and are on supervision, their lives are so broken. And they, in most cases, and you can tell me what I see, is that the same, this is still a person who doesn't know how to make good decisions for herself and never had the role models so that she knows how to associate with people who will be beneficial in her life, not continue to abuse her. And then having multiple children to care for, and the poverty that goes along with, and the prison record and the felony record. So there's no end of the road for these women who are, they're full adults at this point. They're children by this point, and yet they've been victimized their entire life and victimized others. So this cycle that's the hardest part. It's vicious.
So these are emotional, traumatic cases, as you alluded to. And as a judge presiding over these types of proceedings, how do you keep the proceedings themselves respectful? I know Tanisha gave us her story about how she was examined by her trafficking child. And that's obviously a situation that is just very hard to deal with for a number of reasons. You're always going to have this tension between the Sixth Amendment right, confrontation, and the protection of the victim. But what do you do to keep the proceedings respectful as much as possible?
So I think the judge can take a very active, and I think that it's our worst nightmare that the defendant is representing himself. So it needs to start making sure that the support network is there for the victim when she's testifying. And in my view, it should be a support person sitting right next to her when she's on the witness stand. And normally witness stands are pretty segregated. You're in a little box. And so distance, I think, is really important. I think it's important. You can tell the defendant anything you want. Good luck with it sinking in. But for a judge to recognize that questioning will be inappropriate, to make sure that the defendant and then the prosecutor as well sit in their chair while questioning is going on. So so physical space is not a thing. Not done the same for the prosecutor, and frankly, the jury is not going to want it. So it may be in any case that I've had where the pro se defendant is charged with a violent crime, not letting him walk around. And then the prosecutor sits in a chair as well. The fact that a leg brace on is going to keep him in his chair, and then the prosecutor sits. And we just say to the jury, "It's going to sit. It means disrespect." We move on. They get it, but we don't talk about it. And then I think it's important for a judge to be monitoring every question, and mostly to be monitoring the emotional response of the victim and recognizing when breaks are necessary. We're all used to having children come testify. Sometimes it's the defendant wants their own child to testify. As inappropriate as it is, we can't forbid the witness unless they're incompetent. But to keep an eye on that child or keep an eye on that victim and take breaks, talk to them. A judge can develop a rapport with the witness before anything can start, to develop that little bit of trust of, I will protect you. It can be done in a few words. Prosecutors can let victims know that as well, that's going to be, you're going to keep the judges right there and take breaks. I think, I don't know, did your perpetrator stand up and come close to you, or was he required to sit? Okay, so that distance, and did you have a support person sitting next to you? So that's, that should be number one. And it's not a coach, it's just someone there. It's your person who can also say, I think we need a break here.
What about animals, dogs, for example? Is that Has that ever been, I don't know whether or not that's been done or
I haven't seen it. I would imagine that if that's a thing that helps the victim, then support is support.
I can tell you, I've had 2 cases now where we have brought in like therapy dogs to sit with the kid right there. It's been great. In fact, the last time we did it, it was actually the judge uh, asked the prosecutor to make sure. So that was fantastic.
Good to know. To know. Okay. And then finally, Judge Freeman, what's the best way to educate judges and litigants on the law in the case? I mean, obviously we have these, but frankly, we prosecutors don't have much of an opportunity to talk directly to you all. And frankly, the defense attorneys don't either. So, what's the best way for you to learn and to answer questions, to get your questions answered about trafficking cases, because they tend to be very specialized.
So judges are not much different than the jury. And we all live in our own bubble of a life. So it's something I remember from the early days of prosecuting domestic violence cases and child sexual abuse cases, outside of the trafficking, but just child sexual abuse. Judges don't have the life experience to understand why these things happen, why they continue. Why didn't the partner just walk out the door when she got hit the first time, the second time? Why didn't the child tell the teacher? Why didn't the traffic girl just run away from when she was sent out to the grocery store? Judges need that education, and Marty was talking about this is something she does as an expert jury, but judges need to understand it as well, and it affects our ability to rule on evidence as it's coming in and to understand the cases. I think understanding a little bit about the victim and understanding more about the is important. I mean, frankly, it's my view that these are cases where the perpetrator keep doing it again and again. So maybe I'm wrong on that, but there are statistics. When I had someone setting up the next business from prison, it confirmed my view of it. And judges need to be educated about the proper sentence. What sometimes they're very low, and sometimes they're very high, and they're all depending on the crimes.
Thank you. So, Nagwa, thank you for being so patient.
Oh, I love it. Everything I want.
So, tell us about CAST. What does CAST do?
So actually, everything Denise just said is exactly why we approach anti-trafficking. Really appreciate everything you said. So we've been around for about 28 years. So we were established in 1998 before the TVPA was established. And we were essentially born out of the Almonte case. It's the first anti-trafficking case that the government prosecuted. And it was a case out of California, in El Monte, California. It was actually labor trafficking, which is interesting considering that a lot of prosecution tends to focus on sex trafficking. But the first anti-trafficking case was actually a labor trafficking case, and it involved 72 Thai nationals who were being labor trafficked in El Monte, California, through the garment industry. I won't get into all the specific trafficking facts, but everything from being prevented from leaving, so they were barricaded in the apartment complexes that they were being held in, violence, threats of violence to force them to work against their will, as well as threats of deportation, threats of calling immigration. The interesting thing about this case is Thai CDC. We were founded out of Thai CDC. They're an organization that still exists. They're our sister organization out of LA. They had been working with the government to essentially raid this place and bring charges against the traffickers. They've been working with the government. They told the government, and the government gave assurances, and it was the Department of Labor, it was the federal prosecutors, it was different government agencies gave assurances that they would make sure to have the survivors work with the agency to get services once the place was raided. Well, what happened was the opposite. So place gets raided, traffickers get arrested. Now they're prosecuting the traffickers. And rather than making sure Thai CDC can do community care and offer services for the survivors, instead they were handed over to INS, the INS at the time, Immigration Naturalization Services, and they were detained for 9 days. So what you see is survived victims being further victimized by systems rather than the opposite. And so it was really out of that there became this awareness of how important it is to have agencies exist, nonprofit organizations exist to do exactly what Denisha's talking about, which is really make sure that we are providing services to survivors, and that what we're putting front and center is health and well-being, and really recognizing that while the criminal legal system does serve a purpose, I'm not saying that it doesn't, it cannot be the primary system of intervention. Because at the end of the day, if it is the primary system of intervention, that actually isn't what's going to end human trafficking. Because for us as an agency, what's really important is really addressing root causes. Everything Denisha said, root causes of human trafficking. And root causes isn't just some of the micro, it's also the macro. Systemic racism and discrimination is a root cause of trafficking. Systemic poverty is a root cause of human trafficking. Lack of affordable housing, which you all were speaking about, root cause of human trafficking. Lack of access to education, lack of access to income security and employment. All of these are root causes of human trafficking. And so for us as an agency, we are about approaching the issue through a public health lens that recognizes it can't just be the criminal legal system. There has to be these other ways of intervention that is rooted in prevention at the front end, dealing with these root causes so that we can prevent trafficking from happening to begin with. But prevention and intervention when trafficking does happen, and we're working with survivors, and prevention and intervention being rooted in a public health approach, providing access to services, housing, mental health, income security, all of the things that are needed in intervention to really support the process of healing. And then the last is needed to also prevent re-trafficking from occurring. And what that looks like for us is doing wraparound services, trying to be a one-stop shop for survivors in all of the different areas that you see. We have a 24-hour hotline, someone can call us, and we will support their trafficking, support their escape from trafficking 24 hours a day, whatever support is needed to support the individual from getting out of the situation. We recognize survivors. Nobody rescues survivors. Survivors rescue themselves. They are the ones risking their lives to escape. So for us, it's really important to approach this also through an empowerment lens, recognizing that through and through what matters is making sure that survivors are given choice always, because it's the right to choose. It's often taken away from survivors in the trafficking. So we are always about empowerment, about the right to choose, and being a support, whatever that support looks like, whatever the survivors tell us is needed, not what we say is needed. We have a legal, so that also means we provide social services, a long-term, short-term case management. We provide legal services in many different legal areas. There are many different legal needs that survivors of trafficking have, and they have many different legal rights once identified as a survivor. Right to immigration relief, right to family law relief, right to restraining orders, the right to not be criminalized for crimes they are forced to commit as part of their trafficking. They have a legal right to not be criminalized when they are forced to traffic others. They actually have a legal right to not get criminalized when they're forced to do other crimes as part of the trafficking. That could be drugs, it can be theft. And that happens. It happens for sex trafficking survivors and labor trafficking survivors. Often with sex trafficking survivors, one of the things that doesn't get identified is how sex trafficking survivors oftentimes are forced to sell drugs by the trafficker against their will. That is actually labor trafficking. It's forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking. So we represent in that to make sure that survivors are not unjustly criminalized for crimes they were forced to commit. We do post-conviction relief to clear those records. We also do within the legal department civil litigation. And I'm sure you have a question around that. And civil litigation is really key to a public health approach because that is an alternative system of accountability separate from the criminal system that survivors can engage in to hold traffickers accountable. We have a survivor leadership program, so everything we do is informed by survivors, and not just that, survivors will inform, but actually have leadership roles throughout the organization to tell us how to do this work, to tell us, to make sure that what we're advocating for is in fact something that is truly needed and necessary, rather than something that others think is needed and necessary, but has unintended consequences that are actually harmful to survivors. We have a policy, we do policy. So that means that we take all of our direct services that we're doing, and we use that to inform what kind of policy changes need to happen so that we can see the necessary systemic changes that need to happen to make sure that we can actually end this issue. And then we have a training and technical assistance team that provides training and technical assistance to folks across the country working with survivors in many different disciplines. This is an intersectional issue, and it affects many disciplines. Many people from many different backgrounds are working in this arena. So we provide technical assistance to educators, to lawyers, to law enforcement, to social workers, anybody and everybody who are working in this arena.
So you touched on this a little bit, public health.
Yeah.
Framing trafficking as a public health issue. What are the benefits to that? Just in terms of, you mentioned an alternate system of accountability, but also does that bring into play some agencies or some laws that aren't traditionally reached by framing it as a criminal issue?
Absolutely. So the reason why it's so important to approach it through a public health lens is because that is actually since the TVPA, the primary system of intervention has actually been the criminal legal system. And what that means is a lot of attention, a lot of focus, and a lot of resources are funneled into the criminal legal system to be that system of intervention. But as Anisha spoke about, the criminal legal system, first of all, won't address the root causes of trafficking, and also doesn't provide survivors the services that a survivor will need after the conviction. So, for example, just because a conviction happens doesn't mean that now the survivor that is involved in getting that individual convicted, the conviction doesn't mean they're going to get housing, that they're going to have access to education, they're going to have access to healthcare, mental health, that they're going to have access to income security. It doesn't mean any of that. And so a public health approach is really about recognizing we have got to deal with this issue holistically, because in order to end it, we will only end it by dealing with it holistically. And that means putting survivors front and center, not the prosecution of the trafficker. Because oftentimes what's put front and center is the prosecution of the trafficker by any means necessary. And what I mean by that is, I appreciated what Judge Freeman was talking about in terms of making sure that a victim witness in the criminal proceedings has a support system. But actually, what every victim witness should have is a victim rights attorney, because they have rights as a victim, and they have the legal right to have an attorney present to represent them in the course of that. And part of that means that ensuring that their right to privacy, their right to safety is protected, and a public health approach recognizes. I have worked with some amazing prosecutors that just collaborate just in all the ways that we need to collaborate to really ensure that we're seeing justice, and not just in terms of prosecution of the trafficker, but justice, true justice for survivors. I've had other prosecutors that don't like when victim rights attorneys are there. They don't like it because they think we're interfering. And so that is where, again, a public health approach recognizes that what we have to put front and center is the health and well-being of individual survivors and the health and well-being of communities as a whole. And so, really, and it's when we do that we'll see the end, because it's when we do that, for example, we'll make sure that collectively, as everyone who wants to see this issue end, that we are putting money, resources, energy in making sure there's access to housing, access to income security, that we are eliminating systemic racism and discrimination. 89% of survivors that we work with, 89% are communities of color.
And that is because of issues of systemic discrimination and racism. In fact, the government came out in 2021 finally saying that systemic racism and discrimination is actually perpetuates human trafficking and hinders anti-trafficking efforts. If we focus on the criminal legal system alone, it doesn't address any of that. The other thing is again, I think when we look at a public health approach, it's also making sure that individual survivors as well as communities as a whole have the access to the resources that are needed, not just to survive, but to thrive so that trafficking doesn't happen again. Does that answer the question?
Well, it does. I mean, because again, criminal justice system has its lane, and its lane is very well defined. And it has the tools within that lane to do certain things in terms of restoring a victim who has been traumatized to their state, their position before the crime happened. But the criminal justice system can't make policy. It can't, require a municipality to create housing for survivors of domestic violence or trafficking. It can't address the gaps in the education system or the foster care system, for example, where so many, unfortunately, of our youths find themselves being recruited directly into trafficking schemes. So prosecutors prosecute, but prosecutors aren't policymakers, and that's just not what we do. Cannot by our own regulations. So yes, it seems like it must be a whole of government approach.
Well, not just government.
Well, yes, government.
Government, healthcare, education. I mean, this is such an intersectional issue. And I want to say, and I think, again, there are ways in which the criminal legal system has supported and helped survivors, but there's ways in which the criminal legal system has harmed survivors. I want, I just got to be transparent about that and direct, because, again, one of the biggest issues within trafficking is the issue around forced criminality. Survivors forced to commit crimes against their will by traffickers. And that forced criminality is deliberate because it's used as a tool by traffickers to keep someone in a trafficking situation, because now they have a record. So now it's going to be hard to escape, to find other opportunities. Now, and then even if they do escape, they're not going to be believed to be a victim. And instead, they're going to be seen as a quote unquote perpetrator. And so, that is where, again, we work with everyone in different arenas. So we work with criminal defense attorneys. Sometimes we are the defense attorneys. We work with prosecutors in different ways. And in some circumstances, we have the folks within the criminal legal system and prosecutors that understand forced criminality and will say, oh, we didn't know this person was a victim. We didn't know this was forced criminality. Now that we do, we're going to dismiss the charges to ensure that this victim doesn't get further victimized by the criminal system. Then we have other prosecutors that don't do it. They won't do it. Even though there's a law in California that recognizes actually that they're supposed to for nonviolent offenses. So, that is where, again, it's not just that the criminal legal system has its purpose. We've also experienced ways in which the criminal legal system has harmed survivors, especially around this issue of forced.
No, I understand. Well, so that sort of leads me to my next question, which is actually one for the entire panel. How should we measure success in terms of the overarching view of TVPA? What's the best way? Is it the number of prosecutions? Is it the amount of damages that are achieved as a result of civil prosecutions or cases that are made under the law?
Just quickly, those things are easy because people tend to gravitate towards things, and I think and some of the prosecutions are saying that big prosecutions, please, or age. And there have also been horrendous cases in Washington, D.C. with, for example, a police officer who was trafficking children for commercial sex. While he was a police officer, he was arrested, he was prosecuted, there was no restitution ordered. He was released early, then he did it again after he'd been released. So I think there are choices that are being made about who's being prosecuted, and I have to agree that in a lot of the cases we see, it's victims who are being prosecuted for crimes that they were forced to commit, crimes of money laundering. had a big money laundering case where trafficking victims were prosecuted for money laundering when she got none of the money and all of the proceeds went to the trafficking. So I think we need to kind of reconceptualize how we're measuring success, because the metrics that we're using are easy to measure, but don't necessarily
Sense. In terms of, having resources allocated, though, data, statistics, those are the things that are used by governments, like you said, to measure progress and to justify investment of resources. So it sounds like, at least from your perspective, that that's not as useful of a metric of success.
except for civil data.
Of course.
But I say that because I think the civil are to some extent a measure of survivors. They choose when to settle. They choose when to drop the case. They choose whether to go to trial. And I read so many survivor memoirs where survivors say, small by every survivor. So I would attempt. I would make sure that survivors have lawyers, so they could that would have very different. I do want to say, I think in terms of trying to figure out what would be metrics of success, really, that's where government agencies, organizations, they need to go to survivors and let survivors inform the answer. There was a survey that we had done in coordination with other nonprofits to ask survivors, like, what does justice look like for you? And they said it's not prosecution. I mean, that is one aspect, but that is not a complete picture of justice. For us, justice is about healing, and in order to truly heal, it's about having access to resources and services. That's justice, and really policies and practices that are focused on prevention at the front. So for that's where I think we can all sit here and say what we think metrics are, but really, Denise should tell us what do metrics actually look like.
Please do, Denise. What do you think is a successful outcome in one of these cases? Like recognizing that obviously by the time a human trafficking case crosses my desk, it's already too late. Okay. You've already had a person who's been traumatized, a person who has been greatly violated, a system that has failed. So, what does success look like to you in this type of a situation?
Relearning.
Yeah.
Ask Rosen boys come up with a situation. They don't know everything. They know what to talk, right? So I think this gives us, a great opportunity to job readiness, skill. So I think if you guys start with that, we'll end with that. Make good success rate. And people will be like, oh, I want that, but I can speak my truth. I can say who did this, because I won't just be in a dark corner. Yeah, you got me in an apartment, but I'm going to be so. I don't know anything, so therefore I'm going to go back there and do it again. That's the only thing I know. So it is relearning.
Answer. Okay. So in terms of trends, which is always sort of an interesting topic, what are the trends that you're noticing in terms of how the trafficking crime is being committed that makes it something that we may need to retrain folks in the future in terms of how to deal with? So like one example that I'll give, at least that I'm seeing, is the use of the gig economy as a I've seen that fact pattern come up a couple times now, where folks who, for example, are perhaps smuggled into the country and placed in these houses that are controlled by the people under control of a smuggling debt, right? And then told immediately go start working. And these easy to get jobs like driving for DoorDash, or we're working in some sort of capacity like that, being used to generate very quick money for those. So like that's a trend that I notice. Are there others?
I'll say it's not necessarily a trend, but it's something that we see an uptick in. Other criminals who weren't previously involved in sex trafficking now also getting involved in sex trafficking, especially like drug dealers. It's instead of having different pockets of criminals, you've got somebody doing it all. They're the Renaissance man, right? Because sex trafficking is a sexy thing to do. Pop culture makes it look cool, which I can't stand. I wish somebody could do something about that. Yes, if you guys could take that on, that would be great.
Is there like a specific pop culture example?
Ice-T used to be a pimp. All these rappers talk about hip smokes. In the movies, going back to Pretty Woman, makes it seem like a glamorous thing. It's all over the place, and that's what's educating our children. It's terrible, and young boys are like, oh, flashing money. They got all girls, so it's breeding more of an issue than yeah.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because like that's actually one of the primary ways that you can sort of track this behavior is how it's advertised online, right? You have situations where folks post pictures of money and they're like, "Hey, want to make some money?" You have the flashy cars, and even in one case, someone who actually made a rap, posted it online about their activities. But I mean, it seems like there is somewhat of a, like Marty said, a glamour sometimes that can be associated with prostitution in particular. How do we address that?
I'm wondering for Victories why opening up with my whole stuff. Today, my face, that's nobody is or if you talk or the talk, but everybody.
So online safety and the ability to tell truth from lie, or at least be skeptical of what you're seeing. Yeah.
I'm going to add what you just saying. I do think that, one of the things that also we brought up earlier about how much education, how important it is. I think a lot of people don't know what actually trafficking is. Yeah. So the legal definition, I mean, this is where I consider myself a practitioner of justice, not necessarily always the law. Sometimes the law just really is kept up, but the anti-trafficking laws is the one area of law. It's one of the areas of law that I think is pretty good in terms of how trafficking is defined, because the way that the law is defined, it really captures the complicated ways that trafficking actually plays out in reality. So it's not just the sensationalized images that you see out there where someone is, where violence is used, they're kidnapped, put in chains. Trafficking oftentimes happens, it can happen through force, fraud, or coercion. Coercion is psychological control. Most trafficking happens in coercion through psychological control, where there's no physical or sexual violence used, just psychological control. That is still trafficking, though. Most trafficking happens that way. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that. Like, they don't understand that that's still trafficking. Threats of violence, threats of calling ICE, threats of calling law enforcement to force someone to work against their will or engage in commercial sex against their will. That is trafficking. So one, I think what's so necessary is educating people on what actually trafficking is, for everybody, but also for people themselves who might not even know they're being trafficked. We have so many clients that just came to us because they needed services. They did not know they were being trafficked. They didn't know the victimization they were experiencing was human trafficking. And that's both for sex and labor trafficking. So education is so important. I think and then also the other thing I was going to say, what's also important is, one of the things we found, you spoke about it, is love. People, I mean, that is when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, love and community is part of that. It is literally central. And I think that's where creating spaces of love and community, and what that looks like in a practical sense is creating more like recreational opportunities, sports, camps, things like that. Even just like if we're talking about youth, just creating more opportunities where people can engage in community, and building community is also extremely critical for both youth and adults. Also something that we try to really do at CAP.
I should just add one thing though, to trend. One thing that you said was the need for that trend. I think is growing. Something called the Harriet Tubman Fellowship, which is a scholarship for trafficking survivors to go to university, specifically for labor trafficking. She runs it, a survivor of labor. And when she escaped, she had none of the support. So she had to build them for their survivors. So what we have now is sort of survivors building and testing. On the forced labor side of the house, the trends that I see are two. One is scam centers in Asia, which people think that the victimization is here because I lost my life savings, but actually the massive victimization is in Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, where people are literally locked into scam centers and tortured and fraud. We haven't seen those cases really brought here in the United States, but they definitely need. And the other thing that I would see as a trend is what I would call undervaluation of labor. And if you look at one case in particular, Operation Blooming Onion, which was the case, but it was in Florida and Georgia, and it was as many as 70,000 workers who came to the United States on each week. There were 70,000 agricultural visas that were fraudulently obtained by these labor traffickers. If you read the indictment carefully, you get to the part about the money. Because I think people think that sex trafficking has the money. But actually, in this case, it was $200 million that was laundered from casinos in Florida. So labor trafficking actually has much larger, much vaster numbers than the prosecution statistics would indicate. And we're seeing a real gap.
The other one that I'd offer is boys. A lot of boys who are becoming victims of sex trafficking and sexual abuse, especially online, and exploitation, extortion of those boys. But anyway, we are at 6:30 right now, so I wanted to make certain to open up this discussion to our audience, see if you have any questions for our very distinguished panelists. Yes, Antonia. Of course you do.
So fascinating. Thank you so much. Exceptional expert, each of you bringing so much. So, just at the end, when speaking, especially past experience, victims and root causes, and so forth, I have a question to the panel. It starts with an expression. We had the speaker as a cat ambassador, we call the name, from Sweden. And he was speaking how they were victims of trafficking. And our audience kept asking, but do you have shelter for victims? Do you have scholarships for victims? Do you have education for them? Healthcare? And at the end, he said, well, we don't have this for everybody. So my question is, how do you see the social system, the system of social services, our opportunities for any community, poor communities, low income, disadvantaged, and other communities? How they affect our system of supporting victims? How does this system add to our work of anti-human trafficking workers? And would we have this additional work if we had work on the topic of whole community, hope? And then the second, it's a little beyond, but if I just want to give your comments on that. And then I wanted to add one more important reason for the discrepancy between labor trafficking identification and sex trafficking. We have noticed that the fact that sex trafficking is embedded in criminal clearly out has enabled the community to in a much easier way to spot human trafficking because it's built on a criminal activity. And we all are naturally alert in this case. Labor trafficking is embedded in legal businesses. It's starting high. And we think this is a very important reason for the administration and law enforcement not to always spot it, but also for people not to report. And then if we add the fact that we don't criminalize labor trafficking where force, coercion, special means are not present, which we have to do because we have divided protection and law, I think this adds the fact. It's easier to establish sex trafficking with children. It's always there. Very hard sex for child. Children for them. One more question. What about AI? What about the AI being the traffic?
That is an excellent question. So we have to unfortunately finish the program, but I will speak with you about those. It sounds like there's a lot of interest in potentially doing some follow-ups with these panelists or with others. But anyway, I really do want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. You've heard the efforts of many people that are advancing the cause of justice for trafficking victims. I really want to thank our panelists for coming from near and far. They did travel, so let's have a big round of applause. There is a reception after the event, and we can keep the conversation going right outside. So thanks again.